Welcome to Design Technology. This morning we're going to be talking about the router and how we're going to use it to make the lamp base for your project. The lamp base uses a jig. A jig is used to make perfect repetitions of the item you need to create, and to do that the router has to follow a specific pathway and a specific way of working. Now, to do that we need to make sure we're safe. You should wear an apron. If you don't have an apron, all loose clothing, ties, hair, everything else needs to be out of the way. So you need your hair tied back. Long hair in particular needs tucking down the back of a jacket so it doesn't flop over your shoulder. You need goggles and you need some ear defenders. Ear defenders, we're only using it for a short period of time, but if you want to wear them, you're very welcome to. The router itself fits onto the groove of the jig, so it forces it to follow that specific pathway. It's got some controls that you need to get used to begin with. I use the router this way around so that my thumb can lock the lock stop and my hand can turn on and off the design using this switch here. Now, the router itself moves up and down, in and out of the jig, and we have to set the depth of that router to cut. Before we do, let's set up the jig so we've got the piece of wood in the right place, assuming that you've come to it and it isn't ready for use. The wood has been cut to a very specific width so that the wood fits into the jig very nice and neatly. It only needs to go as far as covering the pathway, and you can see that on the jig, so as soon as you've gone past that, you can stop there, because that means we can tessellate the materials and be as most efficient as possible with the material we're using. The clamps on the side here, this clamp is to hold the jig still, this clamp on the side holds the jig still but also holds the piece of wood still in the jig. It's really important that you do that, because if the wood moves around as the router's going around the product, then you're going to have some blurring to your cut or an untidy cut. Okay, with that in place, we can put the router on the starting point of the cut. I often put the cable over my shoulder so I know it's out of the way. The worst thing you can do, of course, will be to run over the cable as you go round. But if you've got it moved out of the way, or you make sure it's out of the way and out of the clear first, then you're okay. So, to set the depth of the router, we have a paddle or a gauge which goes into this part here on the back. You've got a set of 3 height gauges there, and as the router goes down, it will hit that stop to set the maximum depth that the router can cut at, and that's already been preset for you. If you put the paddle into that and set the depth, you're setting it essentially about 4mm or 3mm above that paddle. That means that the router now is set just 3mm into that workpiece for the first cut around the jig. Obviously, both hands need to be on the router. Okay, the lock stop I've put down using that paddle. I only turn it round so that you could see where the paddle went to lock it down. And I need to stand over the piece of work like this so I can see where I'm cutting and see what's going on. When moving the router around the jig, you don't need to move very fast, just a nice smooth movement around the jig. If we go too fast, we could potentially damage the tool or burn the tool. A nice smooth pace around the jig will ensure that we don't do that. Other things of health and safety. Make sure that you've got the router set up on this jig before you turn it on. We can set the depth, we can make sure it's nice and safe. Once we get to the end of it, we need to make sure that we turn the router off and extend the router back to its relaxed position before we remove it. It's really important that you do that extension so the router comes up before you remove it. We have had an issue before where a student decided not to, and you can imagine if the tool is still at the bottom of the router and spinning around, then that could cause you quite a lot of damage. Okay, you need to be safe at all times. Take your time. There is no race here. Okay, let's get this first one cut and you can see some of the issues which we might face. Okay, router on is to lift this black switch here, resting your thumb on it while you're working. That's so that if anything does happen, you tend to move away from something and your thumb will press down and push off that switch. So it's easy to turn off, but it's a little more complex to turn on. Easy off is better. Fully stopped before I moved, ready to go back to the beginning, ready to set my depth to cut my second one. Okay, so some of the issues, obviously we're causing quite a lot of dust. Dust can cause a tripping hazard. So during your lesson you might see myself or Mr. Hudson or Mr. Birch giving a quick sweep round just to get control of the dust. The other thing you can do is we have a vacuum and your partner can be vacuuming away the dust while you're working, and that is essentially a sensible thing to do to get control of that. The other thing is, of course, you'll be wearing a face mask, and that's a really good way of making sure that you don't inhale any dust. It's a bonus of the coronavirus, I suppose, at the moment, which is there are few, so that is good. Okay, router plunged all the way to the bottom this time. I don't need to use the depth gauge. Lock it off and turn it off. Okay, so now that's cut, I can vacuum out the mould and remove the part. Undo the clamp to the left, you don't need both undoing, and slide the mould out. Sometimes it gets a little bit caught up in the entranceway to the mould, so if it does that, just give it a little push and slide that out. When you put the router down, don't stand it up on its end, as it has a plate on the end and it's a little bit loose, so just lay it down, okay? One last thing, obviously the router has two handles, and I didn't mention it, but when you start and stop the router, both hands on both handles, because sometimes it can kick as it starts. Okay, once you've got your part out of the mould, that can then be given to myself, Mr. Birch and Mr. Hudson to have this part cut off. However, if we're busy, you can use a coping saw to cut that part out of there. Okay, once you've done the first router and you've had your part cut out, you can move over to the second router. Before you do though, there will be a large sprue on the side of here that needs belt sanding away, so you've got a nice smooth edge. You don't need to go all the way around, you just need to take that part off, because these lovely round curves that the router's made need retaining. Into the mould it can go. If it doesn't fit, just flip it over, because I think the angles aren't quite perfect on the previous moulds, and it has a certain way around that it goes into this one. You can close the mould down and you can see that your mould is now ready for the router to follow the slot and cut into your design a nice slot for the swan neck of your lamp or clock to fit into. There's one difference with this router though that needs explaining, and that's the fact that you cannot set the depth before you start. And that's because there's no channel running into this jig. It has to cut as it begins. So you need to set the depth while cutting. A little more complicated, but a lot easier if you have your partner put the gauge in position. If you're doing that, make sure that you're still the person to turn on and off the router. Only the person using the router starts and stops it. So the person stood to your right can just hold the gauge onto the position as you plunge it down and lock it off. Okay, so I'm going to have to do this on my own, a little more complicated. I'll start the router. All the way forward, all the way back. Now, for the second cut that you need to do, we can obviously plunge it all the way down to the bottom. Again, it needs to be turned on. You don't actually need to stop the router in between the two. I just have to explain it to you. So we turn the router on again. Do make sure you plunge it all the way until the router stops. The stops are there for a reason and they set the depth perfectly. Once it comes out, there's some little finger slaps on the side there for you to take your mould out of there, and that is the final base part of your design. That's router safety. If everyone's safe and looks after each other and everyone makes sure they give each other space, give each other time to do the task and don't rush, then everyone will be safe in the workshop. Keep control of the dust levels, keep control of the router, and take your time. Thanks for watching.